Hello everyone, I'm Law of the West, and welcome to part 2 of this explanation on how the new flight model is going to work. So let's pick things up again by talking about thrusters. When you shoot a ship's thruster, it'll lose some of its ability to accelerate. Right now it's really difficult to shoot out the thrusters on a lot of these ships. So the designers have been working with the ship's artists to try and make some of the elements of the thrusters be more exposed and easier to damage. Here's another thing that relates to thrusters. The new ship model is going to be a lot more lenient when it comes to physically balancing the ship. Previously, if you shot a thruster on one side of the ship, then it would cause it to start to spin out of control because it was so off-balanced. It doesn't do that anymore, and the player is given a free pass in that respect just to make the game a bit more easier to manage. So instead of spinning out of control, what you're going to feel is a reduced amount of thrust in a certain direction, while the rest of the ship remains relatively stable. And as your thrusters take more damage, they'll continue to make the ship feel even more sluggish. This effect can be asymmetrical, meaning that the ship can end up feeling sluggish in one direction and not the other. This can force you to have to change the way that you fly in some rather interesting ways, especially if this ends up happening to you in the middle of combat. So how is the new flight model going to affect larger ships? It's going to affect them in a number of different ways, but they're not going to behave any differently in terms of their core mechanics. They're only going to be different in terms of how they've been tuned, and they're also going to be really slow and really sluggish to respond. Some of the larger ships have so little thrust that they're going to be impractical for atmospheric flight. And this is how the designers had originally intended for these larger ships to work. The example they brought up for this was the Reclaimer. If you enter the atmosphere of the Reclaimer, it'll slowly start to drift down, and if you thrust up as hard as you can, it'll still keep continuing to drift down until it hits the surface. So once you touch down, there'll be no getting back out again. At least not under its own power or without the help of something like an SRV. Much like with everything else, there's going to be caveats to this. The Reclaimer very obviously has landing gear and some very hefty looking VTOL thrusters on it. And if you've landed on a low gravity planet like Delamar, then it's going to be able to take off and land just as expected. So it's not like it can't land on any planets or moons anymore. It's just not going to be able to take off on its own from one of the higher gravity ones like Hurston. Another example for this is the Starfarer. The Starfarer can escape from the gravity of a moon like Daymar, but it's not going to be able to escape from a higher gravity planet like Hurston either. When the Starfarer does manage to reach escape velocity, it's going to struggle to do so, and it's going to take ages to accomplish. The Hammerhead is another good example on how the bigger ships are going to work. If you try to turn while closer to the ground, you'll see just how much slower it is than something like the Gladius. It's also not nearly as aerodynamic, so you're really going to feel just how sluggish and difficult it is to control. It does, however, still have enough thrust to hold itself up while it remains within an atmosphere, so it can escape back into space without requiring any outside assistance. But because of its size and its mass, you're still going to have to think ahead before committing to moves. Now let's move on once again and talk about the changes that have been done to the UI for the new flight model since CitizenCon. They reevaluated how the throttle works and created a new interface for it. Instead of how it used to be, we now have a true speed indicator and cruise control system. They've also remapped the W and S keys to be bound by default to control strafing forward and back. If you want to cruise at a certain speed, then you'll have to press the cruise control button, which will cause a little arrow to pop up on the HUD allowing you to set the cruise speed, and the ship will auto-thrust to whatever you set it at. The HUD is also now going to be your true speed indicator that shows your actual velocity. If you're strafing left or right, it's going to tell you exactly what your current velocity is in any given direction that you're traveling in. You can change that speed limit by using your scroll wheel to move it up and down, which is an option that a lot of people have been asking for. When the indicator goes red, that means your thrust is exceeding the recommended combat maneuvering speed. Things like the pre-SCM and Super Cruise are now gone. If you wanted to land, you can reduce the speed limiter to as low as you want. If you want to make a soft landing, you can set the speed to a factor of 1, which is going to really slow the ship down and allow you to land gracefully. Or you could set the limit up to as high as it'll go, and you can travel at what used to be your cruising speed. I've also added a G-meter to the HUD, which you can use to figure out how much your ship is going to struggle in relation to its velocity when trying to escape the gravity of a planet or moon. Let's talk about rotational velocities. It's no secret that the designers are going to be slowing things down, which means that they're also going to be doing the same for combat as well. But even after being slowed down, the combat that we have in-game is still considerably fast-paced in relation to other space sims. They mainly did this because previously accelerations were so fast that it was almost too difficult to target and shoot at somebody. Because all your target needed to do was to bank left or right to avoid being hit. So by lowering the accelerations down, they made things a bit easier when it comes to aiming and keeping your enemy in the crosshairs. And the rotational accelerations have also been reduced to try and achieve a better rotation to acceleration ratio for the ships. If you have rotational velocities that are amped up and rotational accelerations that are equally as jacked, then the controls are going to feel more like an FPS shooter. And that's not what they're going for. They want you to feel like there's some kind of mass to your ship, and for the combat to require a little more foresight and a little more planning and tactical thinking, rather than having the controls emulate being a twitch shooter. Most of the ships are going to be able to glide and rotate when there's no power going to the engines, but your effectiveness at doing this is going to relate to how aerodynamic your ship is. So as a result, you're going to get a much better performance out of something that's sleek like the Saber rather than you would out of something that's more brick-like, for instance something like an Aurora. With the exception to balance and tuning, the new flight model hasn't changed that much since it was first displayed at CitizenCon. And this is mainly because of the positive feedback that came from the community about how it worked and felt. The new flight experience that's coming in Alpha 3.5 is not the end of the road for the changes that are going to be done to the flight model. It's more akin to being the next step in our continuing evolution of the flight mechanics for Star Citizen. The feedback that was given by the community during the last CitizenCon was instrumental in helping this process to move forward, and hopefully will continue to do so in the future as more changes are done to help improve the flight model even more. That's going to wrap things up with regards to the new flight model mechanics and most of the changes that it's going to bring along with the Alpha 3.5 update. I'd also like to thank everybody for liking, commenting, and subscribing, and if you like the content, you can further support my channel through Patreon. Every little bit helps and is appreciated. I'm Law of the West. Thanks for watching, and take care.